All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Forget the usual history of kings, wars, and political alliances for a moment, because today, we are plunging completely into the beautifully structured yet intensely constrained everyday world of the medieval nun. We're going to reconstruct an entire human world, looking at the daily, deeply sensory reality of ordinary women living under some truly extraordinary rules. We have to start by grasping the sheer emotional reality of these women. Look at this line from a medieval song. It perfectly captures a young girl lamenting the loss of her colorful secular life. Entering the cloister wasn't just a career choice, It was a profound rite of passage. It involved a total inner transformation, along with a massive external one, symbolized by cutting off her hair and swapping those gorgeous, vibrant dresses of the outside world for the strict, heavy, monochromatic habit of the cloister.
Now, I want you to picture your own modern sleep schedule, just completely shattered. Imagine being pulled from a deep sleep, not by a gentle smartphone alarm, but by the relentless, demanding toll of a massive monastic bell, calling you to a freezing stone church in the absolute dead of night, every single day. Could you do it? Because for them, this wasn't some kind of punishment. This was just Tuesday.
Which brings us to part 1, the midnight bell and the relentless ticking of the liturgical clock. To really understand how these women lived, we have to entirely rethink our perception of time. In their civilization, time absolutely was not money. Every single minute was, quite literally, at the explicit service of God. Their days were anchored by the horarium, this incredibly rigid cycle of 8 daily prayer offices. From Matins deep in the dark of night all the way to Compline at dusk, their entire day was a continuous loop of communal prayer specifically designed to subjugate their own individual will to the divine.
And this schedule took a massive toll on their bodies. Our modern expectation of getting a solid, uninterrupted 8 hours of sleep? Yeah, throw that out the window. These nuns practiced biphasic sleep. It's an exhausting biological rhythm where they slept in 2 distinct phases. They would wake up in the dead of night to chant the divine office, and only then return to bed for their second sleep cycle until sunrise. Let's actually trace their exact physical journey in the dark. Imagine the sensory reality here. You wake to that bell, you rise from your bed, and you head for the night stairs. This was a brilliant architectural shortcut, a specialized staircase connecting their communal sleeping quarters directly to the church choir. It was literally built to minimize the time spent shivering in the freezing, drafty abbey as they transitioned from sleep to prayer.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the sheer physical discomfort they voluntarily embraced, which varied a bit across different orders. The materiality of their sleep was incredibly harsh. We're talking sleeping fully clothed on plain wooden boards, maybe with a thin straw mattress, wearing heavy linen or coarse wool tunics. Oh, and here's a wild detail. Their personal knives had to be strictly removed before getting into bed, just to prevent any lethal accidents while fumbling around in the pitch black.
Moving right along to part 2, fasting and holy diets, the somatic devotion of the medieval nun.
Moving from exhaustion to their plates, food wasn't just calories for them. It was a primary arena for spiritual devotion. And modern archaeological science actually backs up how rigorous this was. Idistopic bone analysis of 13th century French nuns at Saint Pierre de la Menard reveals something totally remarkable. Despite living right next to the Mediterranean Sea, literally right there, they largely ignored all that rich marine life. Instead, they maintained an austere, rule-abiding freshwater fish diet. They bypassed local abundance entirely just to adhere to the strict observances of their monastic rule.
But, human ingenuity always finds a loophole. When the punishing fasts of Lent forbade meat, dairy, and eggs, convent cooks created incredibly bizarre culinary workarounds. I'm talking mincing fish and spicing it heavily to simulate venison. They'd stuff empty eggshells with fish roe to fake an egg. They'd even expanded the biological definition of a fish to include semi-aquatic animals, meaning they could feast on beaver tails without technically breaking the sacred laws of abstinence. Unbelievable, right?
We really have to contrast our modern mindset here. Today, we obsess over dieting for physical health or aesthetics, right? But the medieval female mystic actually weaponized starvation. By forcefully rejecting earthly food, she cast off her dependency on the material world. She transformed physical hunger into a literal, intense craving for spiritual union with Christ. And in a male-dominated society, that level of devotion granted her immense, undeniable spiritual authority.
So that brings us to part 3, the work of God, or ora et labora.
Saint Benedict commanded ora et labora, pray, and work. So, far from just sitting around as passive recluses, these women were actual engines of medieval civilization. They filled those intervals between prayers with intense manual and intellectual labor, specifically designed to ward off the spiritual dangers of an idle mind. They were in the scriptorium producing deluxe illuminated manuscripts, they wove insanely intricate liturgical textiles, and they crafted stunning hagiographical gardens filled with hand-carved wooden sculptures and elaborate gold thread botanicals.
And all this intensive textile labor brings us right back to their own clothing, specifically the veil. It originated during the Crusades as a symbol of profound modesty, right? But within the convent walls, it quickly morphed into a highly tactile, heavily layered indicator of social class. Poorer lay sisters were stuck wearing these coarse, scratchy, undyed wool wimples, while the wealthy patrician nuns draped themselves in heavy, luxurious silk veils, sometimes even decorating them with freshwater pearls.
And that sets up part 4, the wall of Pericoloso and the hammer of canon law.
Up to this point, everything we've talked about was entirely voluntary, a life chosen for its rigorous, sacred rhythms. But in the year 1298, the social and physical rules of the game fundamentally and permanently changed.
Pope Boniface VIII dropped a landmark canon law called Pericoloso, and as you can see plainly in this quote, it stripped away their freedom of movement. It legally mandated that all professed nuns be locked away from the world forever. They were strictly forbidden from leaving their convents, and everyday laypersons were totally prohibited from entering without a special license.
So what started as a voluntary spiritual retreat was transformed overnight into mandated legal confinement. Canon lawyers furiously debated how to enforce this new reality, and they ultimately decided that a nun's vow of obedience meant that any unauthorized exit or entry would trigger automatic excommunication. Just like that, the spiritual sanctuary had been legally turned into a locked enclosure.
Which leads us to Part 5, Defying the Cloister, Aristocratic Resistance and the Breakdown of the Communal Ideal. You can imagine the intense friction here. You have strict poverty and enclosure demanded by the Pope on one hand, and the lived reality of immensely wealthy, aristocratic women permanently trapped inside on the other. Defying the communal ideal of sleeping on straw in a massive shared room, elite nuns successfully fought for their own living spaces. They carved out lavish, heated, private multi-room suites. Some even bypassed the communal dining hall entirely, just using their own personal servants to whip up meals in their private quarters.
Just look at this archival report from 1441. It is amazingly specific. It shows noble women fiercely maintaining their aristocratic status right under the noses of the bishops. The prioress of Ankerwijk was officially recorded walking around in silken veils pinned high, rocking gold rings with precious stones, and wearing silver-gilded girdles. Absolutely defiant.
Think back for a second to the ringing of that monastic bell we talked about earlier. It's sort of the memory thread of this whole explainer. When we listen to it now, we realize its sound had completely transformed. For the early medieval nun, it was a willing, joyful call to prayer. But by the late Middle Ages, under the strict, heavy lockdown of Pericoloso, it had become the daily tolling of a legal warden, just marking time within an inescapable enclosure.
So I want to leave you with this ultimate paradox to think about. Were these physical walls just a prison designed by a patriarchal society to control women, or were they actually a fortress that ironically granted them the time for intellectual pursuit, artistic creation, and deep spiritual freedom that was entirely impossible out in the secular world? It completely reframes how we judge the incredibly complex, rich, and constrained humanity of the medieval nun. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.